Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on Threadripper 2. More specifically, how it's going to absolutely destroy motherboards, the 32 core, when overclocked. Okay, it's just, like, I've recently mentioned the fact that it's going to destroy motherboards on Reddit, and somebody immediately jumps in, it's going to be fine at stock. Of course it's going to be bloody fine at stock! Do you realize how the specifications for motherboards work? They're designed, like, they spec the motherboards so that they survive stock. This channel is not called actually running at stock. It's called actually hardcore overclocking. And if you try to do if you take that 32 core, assuming it just behaves like four 2700Xs glued together that clock better than the average 2700X, because again, I imagine, like, for Threadripper 1, AMD was taking, you know, the top 5% of Ryzen dies were being used for the, you know, Threadripper chips. So I assume they're going to do the same thing for the 32 core, where the top 5% of all Ryzen 8 core dies produced end up in the 32 core, 24 core, 16 core, 12 core. And those are the core counts I assume they're going to release. I think the price points are going to be something like, I think what they're going to do is they're going to keep the 16 core at $1,000, just because, in my opinion, that makes sense. They have literally no reason to lower the price on the 16 core, because Intel doesn't have an affordable 16 core, okay? At least not as affordable as AMD's. Their 16 core is $1,600. Like, you're undercutting Intel by, like, what, $600 for the same core count? So, oh, and more PCIe lanes. So I really don't see a problem with I don't see a reason that AMD would suddenly drop the price of the 16 core. They really don't have to. And then the 24 core, I'd assume, would be like $1,500, and then the 32 could be like $2,000. And I think that would be a really, like, it'd be ridiculously competitive with Intel. Like, Intel can't even, like, they can't do a damn thing for like, price wise for those core counts. Intel's screwed completely. And so, you know, pricing the 32 core at $2,000, that would still keep it cheaper than Epic, because the Epic I think the Epic 32 cores start around sort of 2,000 like 2,300, I want to say, or something like that currently. So it would, you know, it would still be a, you know, consumer CPU, but so that's what I think about the price points. But what I'm more concerned about, but, you know, ultimately my thoughts on the price, what price points to expect, are irrelevant. We're going to find out at launch. What I think is going to be a big surprise at launch is just how freaking not big enough most of the X399 motherboards are. And I'm saying this because let's just think about what current X399 motherboards are like, most of them, what they're designed. So most X399 motherboards that you can currently buy are a 8-phase V-Core VRM using 60 amp power stages. So the maximum amount of current you can push through that VRM is like 480 amps output. And that's, if you don't mind the ridiculous amount of heat it's going to produce. At 480 amps, the 60 amp power stages that most motherboard manufacturers use, which are the International Rectifier 3555s, produce about 12 watts of heat. So spread across 8 phases, you're looking at around 94 watts of VRM heat, and that's ignoring the fact that the IR3555 is optimized for 1.2 volts output, not 1.35, which or 1.4. Now, 1.4 volts, I'm just going to straight up say you can forget about running a Threadripper 2 on that, like, basically at all, because it's just going to be a disaster. But I do have numbers for the 2700X at 1.35 volts and 1.2 volts, and their things still look pretty bad for most motherboards. So most motherboards are basically going to be capable of doing like 480 amps output, assuming you can solve the cooling situation right now for current motherboards. Now, the 2700X, in my testing for Cinebench, at 1.35 volts, 4.15 gigahertz, you're looking at 183 watts of power consumption. Now, some 25 watts of that is the SoC, roughly 25 watts. It might be 23 to 25 watts. There's a margin of error. So, you know, let's just say 24 watts of that is the SoC. And take that away, so 183. And the reason why I know that's how much the SoC pulls is because I tested 8-core, 6-core, 4-core, 2-core power consumption. So I know, so I see how much disabling cores changes the power draw. And then I also tested different voltages, and basically there's like a floor towards the 23 watts, 25 watts that the SoC pulls. So anyway, let's take away the SoC. So 183 watts for Cinebench, minus 25 for the SoC. Then we're going to multiply it by 0.9 to account for VRM efficiency. And we work out to 142 watts for 8 cores. We multiply that by 4 to get our 32 core, and we end up with a core power consumption of 568.8 watts. So we're just going to round that up to like 570. So yeah, you're looking at like 570 watts of V-core power draw from the VRM at 1.35 volts. Now, if you want the actual current of that, you just divide it by 1.35, and you're looking at 421 amps of V-core that, like, you need to move into the CPU. And as I just mentioned, most of the existing X399 motherboards, by literally, like, their absolute maximum output is 480 amps. That is gonna overheat basically every single motherboard. Now, the good news is it's not going to overheat it before Cinebench finishes. Okay, I don't think it's going to be quite that bad. But it is going to overheat every single motherboard if you do literally anything that uses all 32 cores to a similar load level as Cinebench. And Cinebench is really not that hot compared to something like Prime 95, which we're going to get to. Yeah, 421 amps if you want to push 1.35 volts. Basically, none of the motherboards are okay. Like, say the ROG Zenith, the Zenith Extreme, that's an 8-phase using 60 amp power stages. And honestly, I'm sitting here like thinking that, at the time when I did my PCB breakdown for that motherboard, I said it's ridiculous overkill, because first gen Threadripper actually pulls, it really doesn't pull that much power, considering how many cores it has. But this 32 core needs about twice as many phases as what that motherboard has in order to stay within the decent part of the efficiency curve for the power stages. Because that's the thing, the 60 amp power stage, right? If you look at the efficiency curve for them, and should I pull up a data sheet? Let's pull up a data sheet. So let me just get this set up. Stuff, data sheets, FATs. 3555. Yay! Where did it go? Oh, there it is. Okay, give me a second. Bam. So, here's a 3555. Oh, damn it. Right, that's the 30. Right, that's not going to work. Wrong data sheet. 3550. That's the one that still had the power curve. Yeah, because, see, the thing is, the lovely people at International Rectifier don't have there's no public data sheet for the 3555. But there is one for the 3555's predecessor, and that one is the 3550. And basically the difference between a 3555 and a 3550, as I have confirmed with somebody who has access to the full private data sheet, is that the 3555 does the 3550's power efficiency at a higher switching frequency. So it may, it's optimized, the 3550 I think is 300 kilohertz, and the 3555 is 500 kilohertz. And that's basically the only difference, isn't it? Yeah, this one, yeah, so, no, this one's optimized for 400. So, but still, it's basically just a small power efficiency, small improvement in power efficiency versus switching frequency. Basically, if you look at this, power curve, you can see that your VRM efficiency just ends up kind of crap by the time you hit 60 amps output. And that, this curve, if I remember correctly, C notes 2 on page 8, there's a reason why it's not quite hitting 12 watts in that diagram. This is a big problem with these data sheets, is just like the 60 amp power stages, they don't actually have full power curves all the way to 60 amps. They only have to like 55. If we, yeah, see, ends at 55. But you can see how the efficiency just falls off a cliff. And the problem is so they ran it at 300 kilohertz. So they ran it with, because the efficiency gets a tad better if you run it, right, like 400 kilohertz here. 300 kilohertz gives you a tad more efficiency. So, yeah, that's why this curve up here doesn't hit 12 watts, is because it's like that test is done at page 8, yeah. It's done at lower switching frequency than the curve that they have here, which if you just follow this curve, then it ends up hitting 12 watts almost. Well, it ends up being worse than the one that they have spec'd above. So basically, if you want, well, okay, wait, no, back to the data sheet. So basically, if you wanted to have like reasonable power efficiency or good power efficiency on a Threadripper 2 motherboard, you'd be aiming for this area of the power curve right here, right? Like this area between sort of 10 amps and 30 amps. That's where you'd really want to be. If you want the VRMs to actually have good efficiency. If you're going, like, if you start approaching max output, you're just going to end up with crap VRM efficiency, which that's normal. So, yeah, it's just like, that's a massive problem. So basically, you have an 8-phase motherboard, you might be, if you have the current 8-phase motherboards that we have, if you run the 32 core, it might not blow up, but the VRM efficiency is going to be absolutely god awful, because most of them are 8-phase. And for that reason, I'm saying that the MSI Meg creation board, the crazy X399 board that MSI had at Computex, that thing is actually very reasonable for the 32 core. Like, that is literally, if you wanted to, max out that 32 core, in my opinion, that is probably the only motherboard that I am currently aware of that I would say is going to be okay. Because the motherboard that Gigabyte was demoing at Computex, if I'm not mistaken, was a 10-phase with 50 amp power stages. So, like, a much better heatsink than what they had in the past, but 50 amp power stages in a 10-phase. Not big enough. Like, not even remotely big enough. So, yeah, it's like basically for X399, I think the motherboard requirement is 12 or 16 phases minimum. Like, well, okay, not minimum. Minimum would be like 10 phase. But ideally, I'd want 16 V-core. Just V-core, 16. Every board, please, because so like that current figure I pulled that I calculated, the 420, the 420 amps, that's Cinebench. If we do Prime 95 on a 2700X at 1.35 volts is 215 watts of power consumption. So we take out the SoC, again, take away 25 watts, multiply by VRM efficiency, so 0.9, and we end up with 171 watts of V-core power. And now we're going to divide that by 1.35 and multiply it by 4 to get our lovely 32 core, and we end up with a 506 amps of V-core current. Like, you need, like, if you're going to build a 10-phase, you basically need a 60 amp power stage as far as I'm concerned. If you're going to build a 12-phase, you should still use a 60 amp power stage. If you want a motherboard that actually like stays within around, if you wanted a motherboard that stays around peak efficiency for its V-core VRM on a 32 core at 1.35 volts, you'd be looking at around 24 phases. As far, like, yeah, 24. You'd be looking at around 24 phases, which is just like, damn. Which is like, we actually had motherboards with that high phase counts in the past. Like, We had them on Z87, we had them on Z77, we had them on Z68, we had some on X79. But then Intel, Intel, like around Z87, all the motherboard vendors realized, wait a minute, Intel's fully integrated voltage regulator means that you don't need a lot of phases to get good VRM efficiency. Like you could actually get away with some pretty craptacular VRMs, even on like extreme overclocking motherboards. You could get away with a 4-phase almost, because the fully integrated voltage regulator, which like would help Threadripper immensely. Like, if Threadripper had a fully integrated voltage regulator, it would be a huge benefit for the motherboards. Because, honestly, like, the power draws we're dealing with here, right, like, the current is insane. But the power draw is really not that insane, you know? We're talking around 600, 600 to 800 watts for Prime 95 on the 8-core. And that's really not that insane. We've already seen X299 do 600 watts, and it's not really that big a deal. We've seen X299 do even 1,000 watts on liquid nitrogen, and that is a big deal, but it's not like a complete catastrophe compared to this. But the thing is, Intel has the fully integrated voltage regulator. The fully integrated voltage regulator means that if you want to move 600 watts of power to the CPU, you only need to move about 300 amps, because the fully integrated voltage regulator, like for a 7980XE, you would regularly set the input voltage to like 2 volts. So you need you need 300 amps instead of, like here for, like if we multiply the current back up, we're looking at what, 684 watts? And you need 500 amps. If AMD had a fully integrated voltage regulator, if you could just push that 684 watts into a fiver, and then that fiver would convert it down into the 1.35 volts, the motherboard would only need to push about 342 amps, which would be much more doable than what Threadripper 2 is actually going to end up doing for any given voltage, which is just like, there's no fully integrated voltage regulator. You're going to need to push all of that insane amount of power that the CPU will want. You're going to need to push it at V-core, right? You're not going to have the benefit of being able to step down a high voltage into V-core on the CPU itself, because AMD doesn't have a fully integrated voltage regulator, which would really take a lot of load off of the motherboards. So, yeah, it's just this is going to be just a massive problem, and I completely understand why MSI now has a 16-phase X399 motherboard, because it's like that's pretty much what you need to do if you want the motherboard not to have terrible VRM efficiency when pushing high core voltage. Now, what if we were talking about 1.2 volts instead of 1.35? Because 1.35, like, that might actually even be a problem to cool, because yes, the heat will be spread across 8 separate dies, but they still share a heat spreader and a CPU socket, and so they might, it'll be less hard to cool than the equivalent amount of power on X299, because X299 is literally 1 die, which produces all of that heat, whereas these are 4, and the heat spreader is a lot bigger, the socket's a lot bigger, but it's still a lot of heat. But it should be more handleable, easier to handle than like an X299 system. Now, what about 1.2 volts, which might actually be relatively coolable, because if you look at a 2700X at 1.2 volts, 4 gigahertz, right? For Prime 95, you're looking at 153 watts for the entire CPU. That's CPU plus SoC, and still with the VRM efficiency not taken out of it. So for 1.2 volts, you're looking at something that's really not that bad in terms of heat output for the CPU. 600 watts, that's coolable. I mean, you can cool, you can just about cool X299 at around, as it starts approaching that heat output figure, and Threadripper is less thermally dense and soldered. And, well, the solder really doesn't make a difference. No, it doesn't, because you need to delid X299 to be able to deal with that amount of heat. But nonetheless, you'd be, it should be handleable. 600 watts of CPU heat output, you should be able to handle that with a big enough water loop. And by big enough, I mean, two 360 millimeter radiators, though maybe one thick 480 with some reasonably high RPM fans, we're talking like 2000 RPM plus, should also be able to handle that. But anyway, so 100 and, so Prime 95, 1.2 volts, 4 gigahertz. So I think Threadripper will probably, for 1.2 volts, will probably hit a much higher clock speed than my Ryzen 2700X. Or any 2700X, actually. Because, again, AMD is probably going to be stealing, taking the top 5%, which I mentioned earlier. But the frequency doesn't really make that much difference to the power consumption. It's really all about the voltage. So 1.2 volts, right? So Prime 95 on the 2700X with SoC without VRM efficiency factored in, you're looking at 153 watts. We take away the SoC power, so 25 watts. Then we divide it by, multiply by the efficiency of the VRM, which we're still going to just assume is 90%. And we end up at 115 watts, 115 watts of power for the CPU cores. And then we take that and we multiply that by 4. And you end up with about 460 watts of power for the CPU cores. Divide that by 1.2, and you end up with 384 amps of current, which is still really high. That, I think, okay, so now we're at something where it's like, okay, most of the existing X399 motherboards, actually all of the existing X399 motherboards won't explode. At the very least, they won't catch fire immediately, but they're still going to produce a ridiculous amount of heat. Ridiculous. Because, let's pull up the data sheet again. Where's OBS? There we go. Move that out of the way. Myself in studio mode, give myself a transition, bam. So if we're just going to do this lazy, right? So where's a calculator when you need one? There's our 380 amps, right? And if we have an 8-phase, it's going to be going roughly through all 8 phases. So we're looking at like that point on the curve. So that's like what, 7.7 watts per phase? Yeah, that's great. So 7.7 watts per phase, multiply by 8 phase. Oh boy. Yeah, 61 watts. I mean, that is actually coolable. That is definitely coolable if you have a big enough VRM heatsink and some airflow. But have you seen most of the X399 motherboards released? Have you seen those heatsinks? I mean, fashion accessories for most of them. Yeah. This is going to be a problem. But definitely, if you just throw a fan on it, it should be okay. But, well, we've also not factored in that, you need to push it. Well, actually, no, 1.2 volts, that's actually at the efficiency curve. Though there's going to be voltage drop across the power plane, so you would need to actually compensate for that with some slightly higher voltage on the output of the VRM, but getting overly complicated for the purposes of this. Basically, the VRM is going to run really, really hot, even if you're just pushing 1.2 volts into the 32 core. But that should be handleable, assuming your motherboard has enough VRM heatsink. That shouldn't be a complete catastrophe. But 1.35 volts, hell on earth. Liquid nitrogen, if I remember correctly from when I was testing the 2700X on LN2, when I had that thing doing Cinebench at around 5.4 gigahertz, I think it was pulling around 37 amps down the 12 volts line. So you're looking at around, 400, what was it? I'm doing this off the top of my head, so this is going to be super inaccurate, but we don't really care about super accuracy here for liquid nitrogen. So yeah, 440 watts, and we're ignoring the fact that your voltage would fluctuate and all that, but so you'd be looking at around 444 watts. I don't know how much the SoC on liquid nitrogen pulled. Let's just throw out something ridiculously high so that, it gives the benefit of the doubt to the motherboard. So we're just going to take away 35 watts for the SoC, which I think is way too damn high. And let's just multiply this figure by 4, because it's all multiplication anyway. So the current that would, like, the power the motherboard would pull for the core at like 1.8 volts, 5.4 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen, you'd be looking at like 1600 watts. Like, you need multiple 8-pin power connectors at that point. Like, that's crazy. I actually wonder if the MSI board doesn't have six, like, PCIe 6 pins on the input, like, for the vCore VRM, because you'd need that. Like, you legitimately need that if you want to run liquid nitrogen on Threadripper 2's 32 core, because that thing is just going to blow motherboards right up. Oh yeah, and VRMs, like the Zenith, no chance. Like, absolutely no chance. Like, there's no way the Zenith is surviving LN2 with a Threadripper 32 core. There's actually no chance. Most of the existing motherboards are actually, no, not most. None of them. None of the existing X399 boards would be, in my opinion, safe to run on liquid nitrogen with a Threadripper 2 32 core, because unless something happens, like, unless AMD has magically made the damn thing like way more efficient, like, we're talking way more power efficient. We're not, like, 20% wouldn't really make a difference to this problem, because this is a huge freaking problem right there. Like, 20% out of 1600 watts, you're still above 1000, and those boards won't survive it, because again, there's no fully integrated voltage regulator. You're going to need to push almost 1000 amps. Yeah, so anyway, let's add the VRM efficiency. So I'm just going to keep sticking to 0.9, because ultimately we need to compensate for the VRM efficiency of the motherboard I tested on with the 2700X, not the theoretical efficiency of these motherboards that will be running this monstrosity. And the motherboard I tested on was roughly around that 90% figure. It might have been slightly below that, or slightly above that, but it was around there. So I margin of error on all of the calculations here, just say plus minus 10%, and I think I'm dead on. If I give myself a plus minus 10%, and I'm pretty accurate. Well, that's not pretty accurate, but that's the margin of error I give myself for all of these estimates. And even if you go to the low end of that margin, most of the motherboards are screwed. If you go to the high end of that margin, they're extremely screwed. So, it's like that's like they're screwed. that's what I'm saying. The motherboards currently exist is really, really screwed. Now, if we divide that by 1.8 volts, so we've compensated for the VRM efficiency, yeah, you're looking at like 820 amps on liquid nitrogen, which I have no idea how that's supposed to be. Like, that's like this is not like no, this is way more current than like has ever been pulled on anything in the history of liquid nitrogen overclocking. It's like, I think Titan X Maxwell cards got famous for pulling like 980 Ti's, 780 Ti's, Titan, the full-size Titan Kepler Titans, the Titan X Maxwell. Those cards, those GPUs, at around 1.7 volts, those would apparently pull around 500 amps from a VRM. Like, they would pull in about 500 to, I think maybe some of them even did 600 amps. But like, the only confirmed figure I have is like, yeah, they do 500. And well, that's still like 300 amps less than what this Threadripper would theoretically pull. Now, the flip side to this is, with liquid nitrogen, your CPU actually rolls over with voltage pretty quickly. So it's not like you can just keep ramping up the voltage, because if you just keep ramping up the voltage, I had the 2700X pulling like 500 watts or something at like 2 volts, at which point it was extremely rolled over, because what happens on liquid nitrogen is, as you keep adding voltage past a certain point, any extra voltage you add leads to higher more temperature, so much more temperature that you actually lose frequency, because obviously your frequency just goes up because of the temperature. Like, the lower temperature helps you run a higher frequency. So there's a balance point where you have the lowest possible temperature at the highest possible voltage. And if you go past that point, your temperature starts rising too far and you lose frequency. And if you go below that point in terms of voltage, well, your voltage is too low and you lose frequency. So there's a sort of sweet spot. So it's quite possible that with these Threadripper 2s, what's going to happen is they're going to produce so much heat that you might max them out like way earlier than a Ryzen. Though on the flip side, if somebody went and like designed an LN2 pot actually capable of like holding load temperature on one of these at full pot, which I think that like Threadripper 2 is just going to be for liquid nitrogen overclocking is to me super exciting because Ryzen 2000 doesn't have a cold bug, and it's ridiculously easy to run it on liquid nitrogen. At least with the Crosshair 7 Hero, it was just a matter of putting an LN2 pot on it and pulling it all the way down to full pot. And that was it. Like, I didn't need to do a damn thing, and it just ran. And I'm like, well, that was kind of underwhelming, but really, it's really nice that, you know, you don't need to do a damn thing, and it just runs. So unless that was some, you know, Asus, because Asus do put a lot of work into making their like the ROG main, like the main ROG motherboards, like the Crosshair 7 Hero or the Maximus line, right? Those boards have a lot of effort put into them just to run well on liquid nitrogen. So, yeah, as long as that wasn't some, you know, crazy Asus optimizations for running LN2, most motherboards should be just a matter of pull them down to zero, like pull them as low as they go and then raise the V-core and PLL voltage. But so like Threadripper 2 should be ridiculously easy to run on liquid nitrogen, except for the insane heat output and the power consumption. Like this is going to like X299 is already kind of infamous for tripping over current protection on power supplies. With X399, that 32 core on liquid nitrogen, I would honestly say you would ideally want to run like 2 power supplies for the motherboard. And I'm not aware of, like, I don't think the motherboards will support dual PSU setups. So, yeah, that is, I don't know, maybe, like, I'm definitely not going to be able to afford one of these 32 cores. But if somehow I get my hands on a motherboard and a 32 core, and then it like, I have a, well, there's the Hall of Fame power board, right? That technically, well, Galax says it's capable of 960 amps output. I guess we'll test that. Because you can actually run that thing off of, like, multiple power supplies. You can plug in as, like, basically, you'd have one power supply, which, like, wow, that deserves its own video. But basically, it would be possible with if you use like an e-power, but the e-power is like EVGA officially specs the e-power to only deliver something like 500 amps, and then the new one they're only speccing to like 600 amps, and Galax is like, nah, we're doing 960 amps. Now the thing about the Galax rating is that they're literally taking the 60 amp power rating of the 3553 and smacking it on the power board, which the problem with doing that is it assumes that you have basically unlimited cooling. So yeah, who knows? Who knows if that'll actually work? I don't know. Maybe I can get a water block made for the thing or something, and then e-power a Threadripper 2 motherboard and then run the 32 core, because there's a pretty good, and then, you know, then I'd have the ability to run it off of 3 power supplies at the same time. So it could be like a 1600 watt for the main, like for the motherboard plus the VRM, then a 1000 watts and then another 1000 watts, because, well, I mean, if I had 3 1600 watts, I'd just hook up 3 1600 watts, but I don't have 3 1600 watts, so yeah, it's going to be, yeah, it's like on liquid nitrogen, Threadripper 2 is going to be absolutely freaking insane if it just behaves like 8 2700Xs, like 4 2700Xs glued together. It's just going to be absolutely freaking crazy with how much power it's going to be able to pull. So that's a thing. But basically for daily overclocking, I think 1.2 volts is going to be like the unreasonable limit for most motherboards. Honestly, I think it's going to be most people would have most boards would probably be best off stopping around like 1.1 volts. And I don't know what kind of frequency that'll get you, because these things are going to be binned better than Ryzen, than the mainstream Ryzen. So it's going to be really hard to say how high they actually clock at that point. But yeah, it'll be definitely, I think, interesting to see that, because like the on paper, theoretically, these things should pull a lot of power. And honestly, it's like I don't see why anybody would have expected anything less than ridiculous power consumption, because at the end of the day, this is 32 freaking cores, right? You don't just go that high on the core count without some ridiculous power consumption trade-off. Now, the TDP, right, is still reasonable. The stock power consumption is rated at 250 watts. And the way they do that is that they set the stock clock really, really low, right? It's going to be like, the current rumor is that it's going to be at 3 gigahertz. But I think if you wanted to, like, if you pushed 1.35 volts into one of these, then it might do 4.3, 4.4 gigahertz. It's also going to destroy most motherboards in the process. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts on Threadripper 2. I'm really excited for it. There's no way I'm actually going to buy one, because I just straight up can't afford one, but I don't know, maybe I can convince Steve to, because depending on when it launches, I might be able to like do a collaboration with Gamers Nexus, where I head over to Gamers Nexus and do, overclock Threadripper at like their Threadripper instead of my Threadripper. So yeah, that might be an option, that I blow up somebody else's CPU, because I can't see any way that I'm getting one of these. As cool as it would be to play with one, I would want to, like, honestly, I'd be happy if I just got the 24 core, but I don't think I'd be able to, I don't know. Maybe it might be able to talk Alza into loaning me one. And then I'd still have to buy the motherboard. Because that's like the thing I don't like about this, is if I buy the motherboard and the chip is on loan, and then I return the chip, then I have a motherboard that I have no chip for. And if I want to run it on liquid nitrogen, it's like, well, I might actually end up having to put the freaking Hall of Fame power board on there. And then it's like, well, yeah, that motherboard is kind of screwed in terms of normal user, like, usability. So, yeah, but, like, this is something I really don't want to miss. Because this should be, as far as, I just like ridiculous things in extreme overclocking. I don't really care for the like quad cores, 6 cores. Screw it. I want 32. I want triple power supplies on one freaking motherboard. Because this is like, because the other thing that I really want to do in extreme overclocking is run a 4-way GPU setup, which I'm really close to doing. But I mean, I can technically do it right now, but it's just like, it's just on water cooling, so I'm not that hyped for it. But yeah, it's just like, this is like, this is going to be insane. And like, Cinebench on liquid nitrogen with one of these is going to be just like that. It's just going to finish instantly, which is going to be crazy. But the thing is, the motherboards should just trip over current protection before, like, as soon as Cinebench just starts rendering, it should trip over current protection on most of the motherboards. So yeah, it's like, it'll either trip OCP or it'll blow out the VRM at that moment. Because you don't just, because the other thing is, it's not just overloading the power stages, you're also, like, the chokes of a motherboard have a saturation current. And when you saturate a choke, what ends up happening is it stops being an inductor, basically. Like, your inductance massively drops and you get a ridiculous voltage spike, which then leads to more current and basically cascaded failure, where it's like, oh, that got overloaded, everything's dead now, how did that happen? So yeah, it's just like, and you can't, like, most of the boards, like the high-end boards, like you have 60 or 70 amp saturation current inductors. So you're, on an 8-phase, you're good for what? Like 70 times 8, 560 amps. Like, yeah, that's nowhere near enough for liquid nitrogen. So yeah, that's gonna be pretty ridiculous, I think, and exciting. Like I'm really excited for Threadripper 2. And damn, oops. I'm not cutting that. It's just let's end this video. Wait, there, that's studio mode. But yeah, it's just like I'm excited for Threadripper 2 because it's just going to be so ridiculous and so out there in terms of power consumption. And for day-to-day usage, I think you're really going to, like, exceeding 1.2 volts is just not going to be possible. Like, well, you're going to need new, like, not on the existing motherboards. 1.2 volts on the existing motherboard, you might just about get away with it with enough VRM cooling, like a mono block or a fan sitting right on top of the heat sinks, or dedicated VRM water blocks if you can find one. They used to be pretty popular. Like I have like the Rampage 4 Extreme I have, that has a VRM water block on it just for the VRM. And then the mono blocks came along, and I guess the VRM water blocks died out. But if you could get your hands on a VRM water block, that would definitely work. So yeah, there's options to make the existing motherboards survive like 1.2 volts. But once you start exceeding 1.2 volts, I think it's just going to be a complete disaster. This is going to be the boards aren't going to be even remotely capable to handle it. Sucks that AMD doesn't have a fully integrated voltage regulator, but I'm pretty sure Intel has that thing patented pretty heavily. As well as like that thing might actually be really complex to manufacture because like Intel spent a lot of time developing it, I think, or at least it sounds like they have, because yeah, but that would the fully integrated voltage regulator would make things a bit simpler because you wouldn't need to push the ridiculous current at the very low low voltage. You could push it at like 2 volts, and then it would be a lot less, but. Yeah, that's it for the video. Sorry for making it so ridiculously long, but, about a ridiculous CPU that's actually, like, viable somewhat. I think this makes sense. And do keep in mind, this is all just my best guess. And admittedly, my best guess tends to be pretty good. But at least in my experience, my best guess tends to be pretty good. I mean, I figured, X299 was announced when they announced the ridiculous core counts, and I'm like, yeah, that's going to pull a ton of power. And then, the VRM disaster happened, and now I'm like, well, the VRM heatsinks don't seem to have improved much, and this is going to pull more current, not power, current. And that's going to be the main problem, because that's where your VRM loses, that's where your VRM suffers most of its power losses, is to current, not to the actual total power output. Otherwise, the fully integrated voltage regulator wouldn't be such a nice thing to have. So, yeah, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for, making it through it. If you have any thoughts, comments, or suggestions, you can leave them down in the comments section below. I do read a lot of comments on my channel. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon, a PayPal, and there's t-shirts you can buy. There's a link to all of that down in the description below. I mean, fund me a 32 core, please. I feel so bad saying that, but it's just like, if you want me to actually have a 32 core, hint, if we don't make it to the 32 core, I still want to pick up the 24 core. And even that would be pretty ridiculous. Like, even the 24 core would be quite ridiculous, though there's a pretty significant drop there. Like, let's just do it quickly, because I do need to wrap this video up. I just spent so much time going, this is ridiculous. But anyway, 215 divided by 164. So this is just prime 95 figures for 1.35. Idiot. I'm an idiot. There we go. Did it backwards, right. So the 24 core should be about 76% of the power consumption of the 32 core. So for that, you know, if we go back to that crazy 1636 watt figure, it'll be about 1200. Much less ridiculous, actually. That's a big improvement. So yeah, less cores is the way to go. I mean, no surprise there. You're losing like, what is it, 24 to 32, and you're losing 8 cores. So yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, that's it for the video, and I'll stop extending it at this point. Goodbye.